Our professor of practice.
She's always just fun.
Hello, everyone, and welcome. We're very excited to have you here. I'm Susan King. I'm the Dean of the School of Media and Journalism here at UNC Chapel Hill, and very honored to have this position always as someone who's so proud of not only our faculty, but also our students here at the school. As somebody who spent most of her life as a journalist, it's great to know that the future is in good hands, yours. We have a really important panel, I think, here tonight. It's part of a series we've been doing on holding power accountable. We've been very lucky to have a donor a number of years ago who gave us a small endowment so that we could continue these workshops to really focus in on special issues around reporting. And this year, we did pick that issue of covering sexual misconduct. I was recently at a conclave of journalists. We were judging national awards. And one of the things we were all talking about is how would we define the theme, the really journalism theme of the past year. And it will not surprise you that covering misconduct, sexual aggression of media leaders, the Me Too movement dominated everyone's list. It's our business, too, that is the source and the centerpiece of this coverage. Some are calling this a moment of reckoning, of holding powerful white men who control careers accountable. One of our alums, who is an investigative reporter on the West Coast, wrote to us this week when he saw the lineup for tonight's program and said, great idea. Great pushing this need to discuss and learn how to really hold power to account. Our MJ school students, in fact, the rest of us, truly benefit from the leadership here. But doing this is not easy. Covering this kind of story is not easy. It's one thing to think about being an investigative reporter, of digging up records, interviewing whistleblowers, and another thing to realize you're about to ruin a career, perhaps a marriage, a family. Personal conduct has often been off the journalist's agenda. Holding power accountable was focused on corruption and extortion. But we've learned in the last year that dozens, hundreds, maybe thousands of women in the media and politics and offices and in factories have had their careers challenged by predators who held power over their workers. And there's just simply no place in the 21st century for workplace aggression and misconduct. So at the end of 2017, when we learned that Charlie Rose had a history of sexual misconduct in the workplace, we as a school had to decide what to do. In 1999, he was inducted into the North Carolina Hall of Fame that is situated at the school. And we made the decision to use his case and others that would emerge as learning moments for us as a faculty and for us as a school and for our students. We focused on being transparent, and Charlie Rose's bio has been changed to reflect his disgrace. Others will be updated to reflect new information, both positive and negative. So we brought the workplace diversity experts to the school to meet with staff and to come to our faculty meetings so that we can be aware and help our students through what they may face in the future and what they may face now. And we are very happy to host tonight's forum. Our three journalist guests are leading reporters at three important news organizations and have helped to set the nation's agenda at this moment of reckoning. Also with us, Barbara Friedman, our strong professor who studies gender and media, and Adam Hochberg, who has been organizing our series of Holding Power Accountable workshops. He is going to lead ours in our panel discussion. He has put together this really top-notch panel, and I think Adam deserves a round of applause. Thank you. Adam, it's all yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Dean King. Thank all of you for being here, and thanks especially to our panel for coming to Chapel Hill. It can be quite a hardship for working journalists to take a few days off the beat to come here and talk with students. David Folkenflik from NPR, I think you were on the air about 15 minutes ago. You just finished your story for All Things Considered this afternoon, so thanks to all of you. I want to start with Kim Masters from The Hollywood Reporter and go back in time a little bit. You joined The Hollywood Reporter in 2010, and one of your first stories was about an ABC executive named Steve McPherson, who was involved in sexual harassment on the job. And that was 7 years ago. And after that case, things got quiet for a while. And you were pursuing a number of other people who you had heard tell in Hollywood were involved with the same kinds of things, including Harvey Weinstein. But you weren't able to pin it down for years and years and years. Tell us about the reporting process and why it's so difficult to get that last amount of proof you need to put one of these stories in print.
Well, you know, Harvey was somebody we had known about. I think I'd known about the allegations, really serious ones involving him, rape allegations, as early as 2000. And the first time I met him, I told him that I knew about this. He asked me what I'd heard about him. It was at an off-the-record lunch, and he was being very aggressive. And I thought, you know, he was almost like, really, you know, he's a big, burly, and extremely vulgar human being, and he wanted to get in my face at that first meeting, and I felt like if I don't step up now, I'm not gonna be able to have any respect from this guy. So I just said, he said, "What have you heard about me?" And I said, "I've heard you rape women." And that was shocking for the two PR people who were sitting at the table. I thought they were gonna go over backwards in their chairs. And he didn't I've never really specified exactly what he said publicly, because I'm willing to say what I said, not so much what he said, but I will say, I wouldn't say it was an outrage denial by any means. And so from that point on, you know, Harvey was hugely powerful and influential in Hollywood, which is why he kept this quiet for so long. And people were afraid to come forward, and we'd sort of circle back every now and again and say, can we find somebody? And, you know, I'd call somebody who used to work at his company, and they'd say, it's all true. And I'd say, can you give me, I mean, we knew names like Gwyneth Paltrow, Roseanne Arquette, that he had, and eventually Rose McGowan. But I was told there were people who weren't famous too, and there were no names. The story only became public as Harvey's power diminished. He sort of lost this magic touch. You know, he was an Oscar magnet for so long. And the story did become public at that point. And there was a memo, and I don't know, the New York Times, Emily's publication, as well as Ronan Farrow, more or less simultaneously. Nine Times was a few days earlier. Ronan had been working on it for almost a year. You know, there was I suspect, and nobody's going to answer this if I ask, but that there was an internal document that was generated a couple of years ago about his conduct. And I think that was the beginning of being, at that plus his diminution of power, there was something to put your hands on and something to say, we have this internal document outlining this conduct, we're doing the story, will you help us or not? And it became more real. That's just my theory, but I think once you get your hands on something like that, doors swing open.
So the Times actually reported
Emily Steele from the New York Times.
Sorry. The Times actually reported, had reported on that internal document, and I think that really was a backbone of the story about Harvey Weinstein. And really was able to
and it didn't exist.
Talk to.
I mean, it's not that old, right? It's like a 2-year-old document.
Exactly.
So.
But the impediment in the interim is that women were not willing to come forward. They would talk off the record, but not talk.
No, we didn't even have names. I mean, we had no names. He would pay a settlement, and they'd sign a non-disclosure. And I don't know if people read The New Yorker about what he did in terms of a network of spies, who pursued people. I mean, he offered me a book deal this past summer, so I won't do what I'm doing right now. And, I'm still wondering, how much would it have been? I don't know. So we cut that off real fast.
So jumping ahead, Emily, we get to 2017. You have colleagues at the Times who are working on Weinstein, but you are pursuing reports about Bill O'Reilly, who had been a target, nemesis, I don't know what the right word is, of yours, even before the reports of his sexual misconduct had come forward. Why don't you tell us the O'Reilly story? You first got into this questioning some of his journalistic integrity.
So there were kind of two different eras with my reporting with O'Reilly. The first was in February of 2015. It was right after there had been this huge scandal with Brian Williams at NBC News, and there were questions about whether his claims of being a war reporter were accurate. And so I had done a pretty straightforward story as a TV reporter about those claims, and then I was doing a follow-up story the next day, had called him for comment, and he called me back, and the first thing that he said before I even asked him any questions was, that he had found my reporting so far had been fair, but if I did anything that he found untoward, that he would come after me with everything that he had. So this is February 2015, about 3 years ago. It kind of exploded into this big story. It wound up on the front page of the USA Today in a whole separate story. And then I went back to covering my beat, writing about all other sorts of crazy news in the media business. So fast forward to July of 2016. At Fox News, the sexual harassment scandal really burst into public view that July when Gretchen Carlson, a former anchor at Fox News, filed a sexual harassment lawsuit against Roger Ailes, the founding chairman of that network. And pretty quickly, there was a flurry of stories. We were all writing stories about Roger Ailes, about issues at Fox News. And we started to learn, that this was not just an issue with Roger Ailes. This was an issue that was pervasive across the network. We were calling people and calling people and calling people, and at this time it was nearly impossible to get people at Fox News to talk. They had so much fear of talking to the media, of talking to the press. They thought that they would lose their jobs, but they felt it was really important for people to know that this wasn't just an issue with Roger Ailes, that there were women who were feeling like their work was conditioned on propositions for sex and all sorts of other inappropriate behavior. And so Roger Ailes was ousted from the network, but we continued to do our reporting. And in August of last year, this is long before the Me Too movement, long before my colleagues were even looking into Harvey Weinstein, there was a meeting with Dean Baquet, who's the editor of the New York Times, and some other editors at the paper. And he said, he was trying to figure out how we could get ahead of this coverage because there was just all of this momentum, all of these stories. And he said, what about that case with O'Reilly from 2004? He had remembered that there had been a lawsuit with this woman named Andrea Macris, who was a young producer who had worked on his show, and that there had been tapes, there had been all sorts of lurid and salacious claims, and that it settled. And he thought, what became of that? Could we re-report that story with the knowledge of what we now knew? And what would that tell us about how women at that network were treated, how the Murdochs who run Fox News, who run 21st Century Fox, think about this issue? Did this have a chilling effect on women at the network? And so Mike Schmidt and I, he's another fantastic reporter at the New York Times, we just started digging, and I call it dialing for dollars. And we really just tried to figure out what had happened with that case in October 2004 and see just all of the details of that timeline of that story. And in the course of our reporting, we found, it wasn't just this woman, there had been other women, and there was this pattern of settlements. And we were able to really use those settlements. It's interesting because settlements are usually used to silence people, to keep this out of the press, but we are kind of able to reverse engineer those settlements to tell a story that there had been this pattern of allegations of predatory behavior. And it took months and months and months of reporting. This finally came out in April of 2017. Yes. And what we saw at the Times is, this story had a huge resonance. There was so much talk. People were using this hashtag #DropO'Reilly on Twitter to talk about their own issues of sexual harassment. And so the Times then started to report on Harvey Weinstein, on issues of sexual harassment in Silicon Valley, and on the auto workers at Ford. And it really took on much more prominence.
David Folkenflik from NPR, you were covering the snowball effect, and you had a number of these cases you investigated yourself. Los Angeles Times publisher Ross Levinson, James Rosen, another Fox News person, and also two of your own bosses at NPR. What did you sense that was changing at this point? Why do you think there was this snowball effect where we just started to hear first a trickle of names and then a cascade of more and more and more names?
Well, it's interesting, and sometimes people try to date this back to the question of Bill Cosby, but it didn't really take on momentum. I think Emily's absolutely right, and they did such fine work at the Times. I can say that as a competitor as well as a subscriber. Gretchen Carlson's lawsuit was pivotal. And the reason it was pivotal was that she was bulletproof and fearless. And part of why she was fearless was she took an iPhone in with her. She doesn't confirm this, but she took an iPhone with her and she has it all on tape. So Fox was facing Roger Ailes' actual voice coming out. Even if she lost the lawsuit, she had him on tape. And they wanted to divert her as quickly as possible into arbitration, which is part of the culture of secrecy. It's part of the non-disclosure. It's the front end of the non-disclosure agreements that get signed after settlements are reached. And the very presence and existence of settlements, you know, Fox consistently said, we didn't know anything about O'Reilly. And I'd go back to them, as Emily did, and I'd say, but of course you did. We've all known about it since 2004, 2005. We've known about this for over a dozen years. And by the way, we've known about other incidents that came forward. So the idea that somehow this was a surprise when they fired O'Reilly is baloney. With Roger Ailes, there was a settlement in 2011 of a woman who he had been extorting sex from, in part because he had an emotional hold over her, in part because he was blackmailing her, because he took videotape of her performing sort of a sexual dance and said, I will use this against you. And that is the kind of network that Fox proved to be. So yes, it turned out that lieutenants of Ailes facilitated this. Some of them turned a blind eye, some of them abetted it. But in addition, there were others at Fox who realized that was the culture. And if you think about Fox's culture, by the way, it was engineered to enhance Ailes' ability to do this. I mean, if you think about a John Grisham novel, Ailes had essentially put microphones along hallways to listen in on people's conversations in elevators. There was reported, and I confirmed, certain software so that when people wrote the phrase Roger Ailes, a copy would go to some of his security guys to monitor what people were saying internally about him. Now, there's certain things that allow you to do that corporately if it's on corporate devices or corporate email. But the fact of doing it is telling you that they were devoting time and money and effort and resources to monitor what the hell was going on with Roger. The culture and fear that Roger Ailes engendered is only understandable because of the secret, in a sense, that he had to keep. And what the Fox thing did illustrate vividly was say, this is not just about somebody straying over a line. Sexual harassment at its most fundamental is not about a private life that happens to play out in a corporate sphere. This is about power, it's about intimidation, and it is about wrongdoing. And the challenge for people like us is to make sure that we understand accusations and allegations, that we document them, that we do not overinterpret things as entering that realm, and that we take as seriously providing evidence of what it is that we're alleging and characterizing it narrowly and carefully, because the implications of this stuff is so serious. This is stuff that used to be the grist for jokes in movies and sitcoms. You know, a slap on the fanny, you know, an ask for a date, hey, well, if you do this, I'll give you that. Well, it turns out that as millions of Americans have known, men and women, for a very long time, this was not a joke at all. And I think that one of the fascinating things about the Fox case, the lawsuit, the coverage, things that Emily and her team was able to find out, things that I've been able to find out, other folks, is how pernicious and pervasive that was at this institution that was so at the core of our understanding of the news and our understanding of things like the 2016 election.
And what was, sorry, just to add on to that, what was so extraordinary we found about the O'Reilly story was that after Roger Ailes was ousted, the Murdochs said that they were committed to creating a workplace based on trust and respect. And at the same time they said that, we found that the company had struck settlements with 2 women who had come forward with allegations against O'Reilly. O'Reilly himself had struck a settlement for $32 million. That's $32 million with a woman who had come forward with allegations against him. And despite that, they still renewed his contract for $25 million a year. They said they didn't know about the $32 million
And to add on just to that, the notion of responsibility is with executives, and it's also with corporate structures above these executives. So you think of Roger Ailes, he was the founding figure of Fox News along with Rupert Murdoch, and he ran it, and they gave him, the Murdoch family gave him a ton of running room because he was so successful and such a figure. And financially, and such a political influence, and such a cultural figure. And at the same time, if you were to look, you know, when I was doing a book on the Murdochs, I hadn't known about this lawsuit that had occurred at the New York Post also owned by the Murdochs, at which their chief editor, who had been an editor for Murdoch in a number of different realms, chief editor of the New York Post, was sued for sexual and racial discrimination, sexual harassment and racial discrimination. You know, among the things he did was show celebrity, I'm going to find another word for it, private parts, shall we say, in various states of agitation to a female editor at a bar at an official New York Post function. And this was something they fought vigorously and then sort of settled and took care of it. But elements of the case, I think, were dismissed. Whatever the particulars were, this was stuff that they basically went to bat for their people for. There was a case in which one of Murdoch's favorite columnists, Stephen Dunleavy, who had been an Australian who had come over to the States, had turned to a conservative African-American editorial writer, Robert George, and called him a token or house N-word explicitly. And when that was revealed as part of the depositions, it turned out that he was told, please don't do that again. You know, there was not a notion of accountability for the issues that we're talking about today that were set in that culture, and people sense that. One of the revelations to me is the degree to which people tangibly sense that and take that as license.
Yep. Professor Friedman, I want to bring you into this because, you know, one of the things that's striking about a lot of these stories is that the people who were victimized reported it to their superiors, they reported it to human resources, they did what it said to do in the employee handbook. And what they often found was that those people were more interested in protecting the company than protecting the victim. Does that surprise you at all?
No, sadly that doesn't. I think that one of the things we have to think about when we're talking about not only sexual harassment but sexual assault is when you report these things, what happens to the report? And who are you reporting to? Who do they report to? So yes, I think to a degree, people in the EO office, for example, they're employees of the institution or the organization. They're responsible to protect and preserve the well-being of the organization or institution, but they do also have responsibilities that are handed down by the federal government. So there are rules they have to follow, and there are standards they need to meet.
But those rules and standards are fine, but where does that leave the woman or the complainant?
Sometimes it leaves them in a very, a situation without much redress. So there's the issue of non-disclosure agreements, of course, if someone signs that, and people often do. They may do it unwittingly, they may do it thinking it's a condition of employment, and many times it is. They are left without much recourse. We know that people are making multi-million-dollar settlements. So I think one of the ways that people are making their complaints known, if they're able to, if they haven't signed one of these non-disclosure agreements, of course, is social media.
I want to talk about the reaction within your own news organizations as you pursued this story. Kim, just a few months ago, you had a major scoop where you wrote about misconduct on the part of Roy Price, who at that time was the head of Amazon Studios and has now been ousted. But we should point out that your initial writing on that was not published in the Hollywood Reporter, the publication for which you work, but for a tech website known as The Information.
That I had never heard of.
That you've never heard of.
But it's really good.
It's good. It is good.
Tell us how that happened.
Well, you know, I heard about these allegations of misconduct involving Roy Price, and some of it was the culture of Amazon Studios. You know, there were very few female-fronted shows. One of the few was Good Girls Revolt. He had pulled the plug on it, and the showrunner went public saying he didn't even know the names of the characters. It just seemed very arbitrary. Men were getting a series greenlit straight to series, and women were being asked to make pilots. So there was that pervaded, but there was also a question of conduct, including an episode that happened at Comic-Con in 2015, where he very weirdly and relentlessly harassed this woman who, her name is Isa Hackett. She's the daughter of the author Philip K. Dick. So Man in the High Castle is her series, and Philip K. Dick's Electric Dreams is her new anthology. And she is a lesbian married to a woman, so I don't know why he wanted to pursue her. I mean, she's certainly a very smart and attractive woman, but he just wouldn't back off. And this was brought to me, and he lawyered up very quickly. And the person who I think referred the lawyers that he had to him, turns out later, we discover, is Harvey Weinstein, because those lawyers were Charles Harder and Lisa Bloom, who represented Harvey. And Charles Harder had represented Hulk Hogan in this case against Gawker. And that was a very different situation. It was a sex tape, it was an invasion of privacy suit, but they lost big, and Gawker was bankrupted and destroyed. And Charles Harder struck so much fear. I mean, I've been threatened with lawsuits. I always say I could wallpaper my house with the threat letters. I've been threatened by the Church of Scientology. I've been threatened by high-level executives. We don't normally react that much to a threat anymore. But when Charles Harder did the threatening, I have to tell you, not only at the Hollywood Reporter, but subsequently when I tried to take it elsewhere, there was just this heart attack that happened. And it was, as I said, this was workplace conduct, not an invasion of privacy sex tape. So it was a fair thing for a story. I mean, he and Lisa Bloom or somebody concocted a story that I had tried to shake him down for money, to support my public radio show, which was so stupid that when I first read the allegation, I thought, this is like, I mean, as David will tell you, that's not a thing. But I mean, when I tried to explain to my radio show, KCRW in Santa Monica, they couldn't quite grasp, like, what? They kept saying, what? What? You know, it was like I kept saying, anyway, I was then asked by lawyers, well, we don't believe this at all. I mean, we would never believe it, but do you have exculpatory evidence? And I'm like, well, so what? An email where I say, please, whatever you do, don't give money to my radio station, Roy. And I was literally asked by one of these people, if my email signature said support public radio. And in their minds, they were so scared that that was supposed to be proof of extortion. You know, it was madness. And I felt concerned because I have a long resume. I've worked at the Washington Post, Vanity Fair, Time. I felt like if I were younger and less established, they would just immediately make the worst assumption. As it was, they were harassing me about it. I did say to the Hollywood Reporter, if you don't let me take this elsewhere, I'm going to leave. And they said, okay, take it somewhere else. And I had a terrible time. I wrote about this in the Columbia Journalism Review. I went for multiple publications. And you know, I credit the information for having the guts. And they did not even publish. They published, I would say, a fraction of what I originally submitted. All of that ultimately was published, eventually, and Roy Price was gone 3 hours later after that was published. But even then, it was just the tip of that iceberg that it took so much guts just to say that there had been an allegation and 2 investigations, which was confirmed. And yet, that took courage to print at that time. I think it's gotten better now. It's not as bad. I was on this for 7 months. It was a nightmare, and I truly thought journalism is like dying. And now I feel like Charles Harder, people are getting the idea maybe he's threatened the New York Times, he's threatened this one and that one. I feel like he's not as terrifying, thank God, because otherwise I would feel like a very bad feeling about where we're headed.
Emily, what about at the Times? Fox News is, or the Fox Corporation is notoriously litigious. That would be, you know, a lawsuit involving Fox and the New York Times would really be a clash of titans. Was there any concern? Were the lawyers involved? Was there anybody who told you to take a step back and let the legal department review it?
All stories like this are reviewed by David McCraw and the legal team at the New York Times, who are extraordinary and such great partners in making it so that we can publish stories like this. But I think that these stories are so serious and the allegations are so serious, and that's why we did spend so much time reporting and talked to so many people. That original investigation, we talked to more than 6 sources in interviews. That doesn't count the dozens of other people that we called. We had our hands on documents that were the actual settlements that we viewed. We had people who were talking on the record, and before the story ran in the paper, of course our lawyer reviewed it multiple times. We also made sure that it was fair, it was accurate, and both 21st Century Fox, Fox News, and Bill O'Reilly all had adequate time to comment, and they knew everything that we were going to say. We gave them the chance to push back, we gave them the chance to comment, and we didn't face any legal threats.
Did O'Reilly ever come back after you the way he had a couple years before?
So so it's interesting. We did this story in April, the first story published. At the time that story published, we had heard about that other big settlement, the other $32 million settlement, but we didn't know how much money it was for. We didn't know the details of what had happened. And so we published this story in April. O'Reilly is ousted 18 days later. And we move on. Mike Schmidt was my partner in all of this. He goes and breaks all of these great stories about James Comey and his resignation from the FBI. I start to look into Vice Media, but at the same time, I'm pretty persistent and pretty relentless. And once I know something, I'm going to figure it out. And so I kept calling people. I kept trying to, work sources, figure things out. And finally, in October, we learned that there had been this settlement for $32 million that included allegations of a non-consensual sexual relationship, that O'Reilly had sent this woman gay pornography and had harassed her repeatedly over a couple of decades that she had worked at Fox News. And not only that, but the company had known about this before they say that they didn't know about the dollar figure, but they knew about the settlement before they renewed his contract for $25 million a year. And so it was really interesting. So with that story, we kind of practiced the same no surprises journalism that we do. And before it ran, we contacted Fox and we contacted O'Reilly. And at this point, they're separate to get their comment. And maybe the Sunday, the weekend before the story goes, Mike calls me and he says, O'Reilly wants to meet with us. And I was like, okay, because we didn't talk with him on the phone. We had a statement from him with the first story, but we didn't meet with him for this first story. And so it was the Wednesday before the story ran. I was pretty nervous. Mike thought everything would be fine. And we left the New York Times building. We kind of walked east on 40th Street in New York, and we went and met with him in his lawyer's office. And we had a stack of papers. It was probably this big with all of the questions and everything that we wanted to go through with him. And we wanted to give him the chance to comment on everything. And it was this pretty terse meeting that lasted less than an hour. And during that meeting, we recorded the whole thing. You can listen to it on an episode of The Daily, which is our podcast. It was in late October. And so we kind of go through everything. And at the end of the meeting, we shut off the recorder for The Daily, which is this big, giant podcast. But we're both pretty paranoid, and we wanted to make sure that we didn't lose any of the audio, so we both had our phones running. And we had been very clear, and this is kind of the condition from the top editors at the paper, that if we were going to meet O'Reilly, everything needed to be on the record. We only wanted to hear, we had all this information that we needed his comments on, and it was going to be an on-the-record discussion. So we go to leave, and we shut off the recorder, but our phones are still going, and at that time, he kind of leans over the table and just explodes and yells at us and tells us that we need to think about what we are doing, that these allegations are bullshit, I think is what he said, that we needed to be human, and what we were doing was very terrible, and that he was a victim. And so we recorded all of that, and you can listen to it on The Daily.
Now, David, your situation when you were reporting on your bosses at NPR, I just want to clarify, this was not the sort of thing where the PR department at NPR gave you a statement and said, report this. You were reporting it out. Folks already know the story. You were reporting this out like an independent journalist would, at the same time that NPR management was not saying anything about it. You were ahead of the story, and you were interviewing coworkers before management necessarily was ready to have it out. Is that correct?
Yeah, in a sense, that's right. I had an editor of mine. I've been at NPR since 2004 and covering the media for that whole time. And one of the things we developed over time, after the first year or two of my being there, there'd been fights. The Republican Congress wanted to zone out all funding for public broadcasting. That wouldn't hit NPR proper very hard. We get maybe $1 million or $2 million a year out of a $180 million budget, but it would really hit local stations like WUNC very hard. It's often 10% or more of their funding, on average about 10%. So as over time there cropped up a number of things. There was the question of the firing of Juan Williams before the end of his contract. There were other things where it came up. And I developed with some very smart and thoughtful editors a very tough protocol, which essentially said, and it's in my contract, that I can report stories on NPR as though it's any other media organization. There's no interference from news leadership. There's no transparency with upper news management. There'll be my editor and then a senior editor who has no relationship to the story being covered or the actors. Obviously, we all get a paycheck from NPR, so you do the best you can. There's no transparency with folks up, and that's very important to me. And so at times that's been tested, and you say go away, and then they back off. And for me, the pitch to them is this is the right thing to do. This is what journalists need to do, but also this lives our vision. And it embodies our mission. And during moments of crisis or controversy, we are going to show in our actions and deeds that we believe in those things even at a cost of discomfort to ourselves. And that gives, I think, listeners, I hope, and stations, I hope, something to hold on to even if they're hearing about controversy involving us. But it's the right thing to do, and I wouldn't do the job if I couldn't.
Did that firewall hold in this case?
Oh, absolutely. No question. So I first heard a tip before Roger Ailes in the lawsuit of Gretchen Carlson. I heard in the spring of 2016 that there was someone at NPR who had possibly been sexually harassed by our senior vice president for news, a distinguished journalist by the name of Mike Oreskes, a former top person at the Associated Press, former Washington bureau chief of the New York Times, former editor-in-chief of the New York Times owned International Herald Tribune as it was fashioned then. I tracked down the person through an intermediary. There was a legal report that was just put out. NPR, unlike almost any other news organization that I know of, commissioned and then released a 9-10-page report by an outside law firm. I think whatever you hear about NPR, and there have been some real problems I've reported on in great and annoying depth, I would say that I cannot think of a news organization that's been more transparent, but there may be others who disagree with that, and that's up to them. But what I would say is that I was able to track the woman down through an intermediary. This report said that she reached out to me. That's not the case. But regardless, I talked to the woman, and she told me of a long dinner that happened in the fall of 2015, just about 6 months after he arrived, maybe less, in which the conversation was one where she had taken him up on an offer given to everyone at NPR's, NPR West, as we call it, our outpost in California, that he has an open door. Anybody wants to talk about their career or their interest in NPR or their frustrations with NPR's philosophy, whatever. He's new there. He wants to learn. He wants to talk. She offered to take him up on it. When she did a week's tour in D.C., he said, well, let's talk for coffee. He had a meeting that pushed late. He then said, let's get a drink. And when they went out for a drink, he said, you know what, it's late. Why don't we just get a bite for dinner? She says, sure. Of the two choices, she chose the less formal restaurant. But it was about a 3-hour dinner at which he ordered a bottle of wine, and since she wasn't deciding to drink much of anything that night, he finished almost all of it himself. And she felt that on a number of occasions, it veered toward the personal. On a number of occasions, he asked about her personal life. On one occasion, he was referring to a former flame, and he talked about her as his first sex girlfriend, by which I believe he meant, or she took to mean, the first woman with whom he had sex. This is weird stuff to be talking about with your editor-in-chief, which is what Mike was. On the other hand, I want to be clear. He didn't talk about sex explicitly. He didn't make any propositions to her. He didn't invite her home that night. He walked her to Union Station where she got on the train home. He gave her a non-romantic hug, still weird. This is her characterization, not mine. And he took the train. She says she sobbed for 45 minutes in Union Station, took the train home to Baltimore, sobbed for another hour after talking to her boyfriend about what had just happened. And she filed, to her great credit, this is a young woman in her 20s, a junior producer at the time, she filed an HR complaint. And they, by her account to me, took it seriously. They kept her in a loop. As we now know, within a week, he had been formally reprimanded. And what we did not know was that there had been a second complaint. But I knew of one complaint. I'd heard that it was possible there had been a second complaint. This was the spring of 2016. I scoured the network, and nobody knew of a second complaint. And I said to my bosses, I may be wrong. I've called a couple people at the Times and at the AP. I don't know of past incidents there. I don't think that one instance of a human resources complaint on its own, without an invitation, with no offer or predication of job, with no explicit sex talk. I don't know if everything that happens is national news. I think we have to have an imaginary post-it note on our terminal, so if other things come up, we know that this is there. On the other hand, if I were doing a 3,500-word profile of Mike Oreskes, I'd certainly put that in it. But I don't know that I'd be doing that profile absent this issue. And so we kind of played around for a while. It said, let's keep open. Roger Ailes happens. The issue is foremost of mind. We do a little more reporting in fall of 2016. And then there's an agitation in the newsroom. And people are talking about it. But every single point of contact on it comes back to the same complaint, the same young woman, the same issue. And I said, in the absence of knowing more, I don't see it's there. In October 2017, we hear that a woman has complained. It turned out to have been two women. But a woman has complained that Mike kissed her while discussing job prospects in the 1990s while he was the Washington bureau chief of the New York Times. And
where did you hear this?
I heard this from sources at NPR that a woman had called NPR's HR department. We were not able to get formal confirmation of that, and we did not know, we did not get to talk to the women ourselves. And in the absence of talking to a woman, or at least giving her a chance to talk about it, like I didn't know the names of the woman making those claims. We didn't decide to pull the trigger. We knew that this was a cause of concern. We did try to do more reporting, couldn't get it. The Washington Post did a story about the two women, not named, who had alleged that he had kissed her in the late 90s. Now, at that time, I don't know if I feel about it the same day, but at that time, in October of last year, I thought, if I only knew about two women who almost 20 years ago complained he kissed them, who were not working for him at the time, and couldn't prove anything more contemporary, I don't know if I would have gone with it. Knowing that I knew that there was an HR complaint at NPR within 6 months of his arrival, I did a story within 2 hours of the Washington Post posting. He was then, I think, put on leave and the next day required to resign. And the two halves of that equation, I think the Post story opening the door and my knowing that there was something current meant that we had to do it. And then we continued to report. We revealed another, like the number 4 or 5 editor, that there had been incidents that subsequently were complained about after our coverage. We reported on the chairman of the board not taking a third term because there had been concerns raised, although we were not able to get into great detail. He assigned it to something that happened a decade ago. And others, our sources suggested otherwise, that there were multiple concerns, but not at NPR per se. You know, our feeling is we had to report transparently on it and hold it very much accountable. We don't want to over-cover our doing. We're not an industry newsletter, but we feel if you're listening to NPR, you're probably slightly more interested in what's happening there than not.
Barbara, where's the line? I mean, we just heard about a boozy dinner, but nothing that would come close to the line of sexual assault. We had Garrison Keillor yesterday, you know, gave his version of his situation, and he said, well, I was railroaded for what he called romantic writings. Now, granted, these were romantic writings and emails to his staff, so take that as you will, but is there a line? Is there a line? Is all of this behavior inappropriate, or is there a line that you can get up to where it might be okay?
Well, I'd be interested to know what the journalists think the line is in terms of reporting. And I'm also curious to know what the network is by which you figure out there's been an HR complaint, since HR complaints are supposed to be confidential. So I'm not a lawyer, but the law on sexual harassment does offer some definition, and under federal law, it would probably recognize a boozy dinner as not harassment. I think it's annoying jokes. There are like 3 conditions that don't rise to the level of illegality unless they're serious. And then serious, of course, is a subjective matter for the person who experiences the abuse, as well as for the employer and the person who's accused. So I would be curious to know, like, how the journalists identify that line. What rises to the level of harassment that is worth reporting or pursuing?
For me, I like the easy calls, like really bad behavior, so we don't have to, but unfortunately, some of the calls are not easy at all. And all I can tell you people is there's a case-by-case assessment, how egregious is the conduct. I mean, when you see something like the Kevin Spacey story become public and Netflix drops him like a hot brick, you know that they knew. You know that they are just bye-bye to one of the big stars that they have, And so something like Kevin Spacey and Harvey Weinstein are at this end. And then, you have things that happened, as David was, that about years ago. Or things where I did the John Lasseter story. He's the head of Disney Animation and Pixar. And, Disney tried to say that this was about hugging. He was just a hugger. But we had people telling us this was really uncomfortable. This was not hugging. We had allegations of kissing, groping. And the reason we know about HR complaints is not because HR tells us, it's because other people and people know in a community, especially animators, who I have to say are the most gossipy people. Thank God for them, but they know everything, and but I will say that because of when someone is in peak of power, as John Lasseter was, I mean, I wasn't thrilled to be doing that story because he was so important to Disney, Frozen, Toy Story, all of that. That becomes very hard to get, so the allegations can be super serious, but when they're still at the top of their game, it's much tougher. So it's always, are we doing this? Are we doing this? What do we have? How solid is it? Is it egregious enough? And it's not I can't come up with a single formula.
I think one of the things that we've learned during the course of this reporting is that many of the institutions and the systems in our society that were established to try to prevent this issue actually are broken. So number one, women generally, there's all of these studies that show that women don't complain about this behavior when it happens. They don't tell their friends, they don't tell the company because they fear that they won't be believed and that nothing will happen. If women do go to HR, what we've found in many cases is that HR works on behalf of the executives rather than the employees. One of the stories that I did at the end of last year was about Vice Media, and there were some really interesting examples of what women who worked there said the response was from the HR person at the company. So women said that there was this one woman who went on the record and told this story about being at a bar one night with someone who was more senior to her at the company, and that he started to kiss her and she had to beat him off with the umbrella, and she went and so that he would stop. And she told the HR woman about this. The HR woman, before working at Vice, had worked at the Weinstein Company before, or at Miramax. She had worked for the Weinsteins. And what this woman said, the HR woman told her was, you're a beautiful woman. This is going to happen to you during your career. And so what kind of the effect that had in the company is that woman told her friends, and then people didn't feel like they could report this behavior. And we heard very similar examples of that chilling effect happening at Fox News. In addition, the law is very murky, and so what is the definition of sexual harassment is not clear. And another thing that's a huge issue are these legal settlements that are used in many cases to resolve these issues. So it's very rare that these cases actually make it into a public court where there is a judge and a jury and a trial that decides whether decides on the debate. But what does happen in many of these cases, and with almost all of the cases that I've reported on, is that a woman tries to resolve this through the company, and then she goes and finds a lawyer. The lawyer writes this letter with an intent to sue to the company or to the person, and then very quickly settlement discussions begin. Those settlement discussion. A lot of times women feel that they're forced into reaching these settlements. They don't think that they have any other recourse. And as a condition of those settlements, the women are required to sign confidentiality agreements. In many cases, we've found that those confidentiality agreements have made it so that the victims are silenced, nobody knows that there's been this pattern of predatory behavior, and that the perpetrator has been allowed to continue. And so I think one of the things that we are really trying to focus on and think about is, what are these systems, what are these blocks in our institution that have allowed this behavior to continue? And it's not just about kind of holding this one powerful man accountable, but it's looking at this entire structure.
And to add to the question, not to build on that, but also to address the question a bit in terms of information coming to light, HR is supposed to be confidential, and one of the things NPR and Fox and other places stress, sometimes in good faith, sometimes perhaps not, is that these are meant to be confidential, both to protect the interests of those who are filing allegations and complaints, and those against whom complaints have been lodged. They cannot automatically assume that somebody has done something terrible simply because a complaint has been lodged. They got to look into it in good faith. But I think part of the reason why we're able to talk to people is that either the people directly affected or their friends and colleagues have lost full faith in the corporation or the HR departments to deal with this, and it's like a release valve of information that has built up and been kept private and somehow needs to come to light.
And what we saw in so many of these cases is that the company knew. The company knew about this behavior. Right. They had these stories. They knew more than what we did, and it wasn't until we published the stories that anything happened. And I think one of the most striking cases of this is the example with the O'Reilly story. But then in addition, Kim's story about Roy Price at Amazon was so fascinating to me, because not only did the company know about this, not only had they conducted an investigation, not only was there a story published in the information in August, but it took this woman going on the record in the midst of this kind of frenzy over the reporting about Harvey Weinstein for the company to actually do anything.
Yeah, I could not understand it. It's like they made it as bad for themselves as it could possibly be. And they never, even, while he was threatening to sue, they were not pushing back on anything. They didn't deny any of it. But they sat there and waited for everything to come out, and then they decided to do something.
And for so long, the big question was, what was the business calculation inside of these institutions? What was Fox and Fox News and 21st Century Fox thinking when they saw this record of complaints against O'Reilly? But then they also saw, this man brings in hundreds of millions of dollars in ad revenue. He's the anchor of our primetime lineup. Which is more important to us? And for so long, you can make your own assumptions, but for a long time, it was that money.
Look at NBC and Matt Lauer. NBC wanted to take a victory lap for firing him within a day or hours or whatever it was of Huffington Post and others coming forward with stuff. They had known for weeks these stories were coming. They could have taken action independently. NPR knew there were issues about Mike Oreskas, less severe than Lauer, less severe than O'Reilly, less severe than Weinstein, but still real and distortive and affecting the newsroom. NPR didn't do so until the Washington Post, and then we weighed in and revealed to the world some issues that they then could not so easily handle. And it did affect their thinking, and they've acknowledged mistakes. But NBC wanted a victory lap for taking care of Lauer. They said as soon as this stuff was brought to light. It's not as soon as this stuff's brought to light. If you think about the O'Reilly stuff in Fox News, they said, he was gone within 18 days or whatever it was. Fox News had been negotiating and knew of O'Reilly's negotiation because there were these proffer letters back and forth over, anytime somebody has a settlement or anytime there's been discussions of a lawsuit, the lawyers are laying out in extraordinary detail what they're going to do to beat them in court.
They're basically saying, here's what we know. This is what the lawsuit is going to say.
So anytime a corporation says, we haven't had time to respond to this, or a lawsuit hasn't been filed yet, or this is the first that this has been publicly addressed, they hold more cards than you do already. So they are acting on what is probably slightly incomplete knowledge that we have that's still more than enough to force them into action in certain ways. If you look at the piece I did on Ross Levinson, who was until late January, I guess, the publisher and CEO of the Los Angeles Times, what's astonishing to me is they didn't have to dig very far. Among the key elements, the skeleton of my story were 2 lawsuits in which he had been a defendant in sexual harassment lawsuits in California, which is far from a distant land from Los Angeles. Now, he was not the only defendant, and surrogates of him have fanned out to major influencers to say, he was just named because he was a boss or whatever. If you actually read the depositions, which I have, he personally acknowledges rating the hotness of his female employees as an executive. He personally acknowledges speculating where one of his employees was a stripper on the side. He personally acknowledged a number of things. In another lawsuit, he was accused by people's sworn testimony of creating essentially a frat house atmosphere. And he was a superior to somebody who was sued in a second case when he was at Fox Sports, not Fox News, he was the superior of a guy who was accused of basically making quid pro quo demands, saying, you got to sleep with me if you want to become a reporter instead of just a producer. But he also told the defendant, if I'm remembering the case correctly, that he didn't want to hear about her problems. At another point, he pointed to a sideline reporter who had previously been a cover model for Maxim and other men's magazines. And he said, you should model yourself on her. That's someone who's figured out how to work well with executives here. And meanwhile, the executives were sending pictures of her, essentially topless, the other woman, to one another and marveling over it. It was another sort of fraternity-like atmosphere that was being at least characterized in those court documents. Those were in court documents. These guys are supposed to hire headhunters and vetters and people who look for this stuff. And the parent company, the Los Angeles Times, either failed to do that or didn't care. And so this was something that, to my mind, was worth reporting. When we talk about the way in which Harvey Weinstein operated, it's not as menacing, it's not the same thing as Roger Ailes having recording devices.
Oh, it's menacing.
But Ross Levinson didn't respond to my questions. He called my CEO and he said, it's all a bunch of lies, including apparently his own sworn testimony, but whatever. And secondly, he said, if I feel belittled or demeaned in this, I will retain legal counsel, which suggests something of a legal threat, which is a fascinating stance to take from a guy who at that time, although not longer, was the head of one of the most important newspapers in the country. So, you think the impulse here was CEO to CEO, I'm going to handle this, not there's a news story that I need to address the substance of.
We're going to take questions from the audience in just a moment. There's some people with microphones, so if you have a question, raise your hand and they will find you. But I want to throw out one question to the panel first, and that is there anybody here who fears that the pendulum has swung too far? President Trump tweeted a few weeks ago, people's lives are being shattered and destroyed by a mere allegation. Some are true and some are false. Some are old and some are new. There is no recovery for someone falsely accused. Life and career are gone. Is there no such thing any longer as due process? And he was probably talking about domestic violence charges, which is a little bit different from sexual misbehavior, but I suspect, not to try to guess what's in the president's head, I suspect he would feel the same way. Does anybody here have any concern that we've gone too far on the side of not empathizing with where the men are?
I think all 3 of us know how many hoops we have to jump through to get any of this stuff published. I know things right now that would be career enders for people that I have not been able to. I know that I don't think I know, but I can't get past that legal review, and it can be really, really frustrating. But we don't just fire these stories out there. That is not a thing. So I think, the concept, we can't really be responsible about where is the pendulum. We just have to do our jobs. And for me, the imperative is If those stories come to us, we keep doing them. We have some readers say, we're bored, I don't even read those stories anymore. And I feel like, well, then don't. I don't care. It's part of our job. If we don't want this to be a very transitory moment, and then it goes back to the way it was with the frat house environment, which permeates Hollywood still, we have to just keep telling the stories. And it's not easy legally, and we don't do it lightly, but we have to keep doing it.
Anybody else want to weigh in on this?
I think that in terms of due process, you can make the argument that the people who were exploited or harassed were not given due process. Their employer didn't protect them as they should have. The people who have been punished are being punished by their employers who don't want to be associated with their behavior or have been called to account for behavior they knew about, but they want to dissociate their organization from that person. If the person feels like they have been terminated or suspended or disciplined unjustly, they do have the means to sue or appeal the decision. So I think the discussion of due process will come up in the reporting. That's another phase that will follow if we look at the way reporting has addressed these kinds of issues historically. This is likely to be one of the next phases, but I think the charge that due process is not available is not a valid argument.
Look, there are ways in which not everything that happens in the workplace or in the sort of larger shadow of the workplace is national news. There's got to be a reason for doing it. The Times has, I don't know how many people covering media. In terms of the conventional media, there's basically just me at NPR. You have to pick your shots. We have a lot of fantastic colleagues doing a lot of work, and I have colleagues in entertainment, Silicon Valley, what have you. But you just have to pick your shots. Am I providing something of value to that institution, to my listeners, to my readers? Is there a point for doing this? Some things it's hard to meet review, but sometimes you said, does this rise to the level? Is this the kind of accountability, or is this a more contextual understanding of this person in a larger picture that perhaps, it should be part of a greater mosaic of understanding, but isn't the point of a hard-edged story? There are times where you strain to figure out what analogies there are. Is this like when the fall of the Berlin Wall and the Stasi files are opened, and suddenly we are no longer blinded and can see insights into how some of our fellow citizens operated, even at the highest levels. Shelly Ross, a former network executive at ABC, I think she worked for all three of the big ones, but ABC and NBC proposed some sort of Truth and Reconciliation Commission where people would come forward and make accusations and make concessions, but with perhaps not punishments, but acknowledgments, and the notion that with a new record created, we should move forward with a different understanding of how we do things. I do think that if people are wrongly accused, which has not, by and large, seemed to be the problem, that, if you look at the press, we do tend to cover more the filing of lawsuits than their dismissals or than the loss. I do think that is a problem for the press, from the small to the large. And I do think that there's a reputational destruction that occurs, but I think that perhaps reputations were inflated or exaggerated to begin with, and we didn't have an understanding of other people whose careers were thwarted. So while I think that we should never lose our humanity as journalists or fail to understand that there are costs to our potential costs to our reporting, we would be inflicting harm on others were we to ignore some of these very important things that were being brought to light. I think of Fox News as just such an incredible, pungent example. They didn't think about O'Reilly being a problem because it was part of the recipe for success. It was part of how Roger Ailes conceived of his institution. And so, to not do that would have been a grave harm there. And the institution itself needed to be revealed for the very nature of it, how it operated. I've talked to, I can't tell you a number of, not people who just worked there, but executives who acknowledged that it was a corrupted enterprise in many ways. Like, this is an invaluable moment that we need to take advantage of. It's not being an advocate to want to tell the truth. It's kind of the point of why we're in business.
One of the things I think has been so extraordinary about this moment is that for so long we've all heard the statistics of the number of women who've been victims of harassment or assault or misconduct, but we didn't always hear their stories and hear their voices, and I think that the world is starting to listen to them in a way that hasn't really been done before, and I think that's something that we're seeing really change in our society, and I think that's valuable. I think it's important, and I think it's about respect, and it's about treating men with respect, and it's about treating women with respect.
Okay. Who has a question from the audience? Where's our microphone?
Hello, I'm Andy Bechtel. I teach editing and writing here at the JC.
He was one of my professors.
Nice to see you again. My question is something that David actually touched on a little bit, the idea of the victory lap, in that a lot of this reporting, and as I observe it and read it and listen to it, I see the reaction to it. It is very partisan in a lot of cases where someone will say, aha, I knew that Bill O'Reilly was a big jerk, or aha, I knew those people in NPR were hypocrites. But they don't see the other side of the equation. They just want to defend the person that they like, but also attack them. They don't on a partisan viewpoint. Whereas to me, it seems like this is across the board. It's happening everywhere. I think we could agree on that. How do we make that jump to let people understand this is not a partisan issue or a reason to have schadenfreude about the people you dislike falling and the ones falling? How do we resolve
I think that was one of the most powerful things about this coverage over the past year is that it did start with Fox News, but then in the fall, we had at the time some very important reporting about Harvey Weinstein, who was this champion of the left. And so what we saw was that this wasn't an issue of conservatives, it wasn't an issue of liberals, but this was an issue with how our society views and treats women, which is half of the population.
And let me just add two things to that, if I might. One is I think that news organizations have to be a lot better about being transparent. I don't see the kind of muscularity of intent on other news organizations that I think we've provided at NPR. This is not about Emily at all, but I would say the New York Times could have offered a little bit more of its own reporting than looking at Glenn Thrush, who is not an editor, not an executive, but nonetheless accused of some things. And it was covered, but its coverage, to my mind, relied on Vox News's reportings on that rather than doing its own. I think of Mike Oreskes, the two worst things he was accused of in some ways involved his times at the New York Times. And it seemed to me that they basically, again, this has nothing to do with Emily, she was involved in other stuff, but they basically relied on somebody saying, well, we picked up a call and talked to Joe Lelyveld, who was executive editor at the time, and he said he doesn't remember anything about it. You know, they were going back to the 80s or 90s on Weinstein. I think it's important that we think hard about this. You know, NBC News in reporting on Matt Lauer had me on to talk about it because it was they had a senior reporter signed to it, and she reflected what was in the public news, but there was no real additional reporting going on there about Matt Lauer. They were kind of reflecting what others had already reported. And it seems to me that that's a way of indicating this is really a big problem with whomever we can find out is happening at other places, but not going to bat so much on our own there. The second thing is, I think this is about the media because it's important. Media institutions are prominent. They are influential, if not powerful. There's a lot of celebrity that attaches to the TV side of it. You know, entertainment, obviously, celebrity and glitch attaches that, but you know, institutions like the Times and NPR and some others have made a point of going after, shall we say, less face-forward institutions. I mean, the way to make it nonpartisan is to point out this is happening. I mean, there's an incident of
We did a great story about Ford.
Yeah, I was just literally about to say the Ford executive was quietly pushed out. One of the head of their North American operations, terrific reporting on that. We and others have done stuff on, you know, fast food employees, women, particularly single moms working 2 shifts. You know, these are extremely vulnerable people, but they don't know how to use a microphone like Gretchen Carlson does. Right? They don't know how to use their voices. They don't know how to take command of a media landscape to do that. When you started seeing this conversation shift to, you know, you can think of accountants and, you know, aviators and architects. These are the A's. You know, like in any field you pick, this is going to be an issue, right? So the question is whether you take this out of the realm, media bleeds into politics, you make it less partisan in that regard, I think.
Other questions?
Okay, I'm not exactly sure how to phrase my question, but you talk about that there's been more accountability now. I keep wondering why, when people reference Harvey Weinstein all the time as the worst, why do we not hear Bill Cosby's name or Donald Trump's name, who, you know, have 20 to 50 women who have come forward. And why has that gotten lost somehow? And also, on the other end of the spectrum, someone like Al Franken, who I read that he kissed this woman against her will, who's very photogenic and very good, in front of the camera, and that he put his hand on women's butts several times when taking pictures. Is there something else we don't know? Because there was such a rush to judgment and he was out, whereas other people are still in, and I can't figure it out. Maybe you can illuminate it for me.
I mean, we see a lot of coverage of Trump. I think people are trying to figure out how to keep that story going in a way, because I think that story has fueled so much of the Me Too moment. I don't think Harvey in a vacuum would be the huge story he is if Trump were not in the White House with all of these accusers. We just saw yesterday Jake Tapper asking Ivanka how she... No, I think it was... Who was it? Okay, a reporter. Maybe, yeah, I think you're right. And she, she was, I wouldn't say she, there's been a lot of second-day stories about, and opinion pieces. She said, you don't have the right, it's inappropriate. I have the right to believe. That's being dissected a lot in the media. So I do think that, with Cosby, what you have is a grinding criminal process at this point. I think everybody knows what they need to know about the allegations against Bill Cosby. It's just a question of whether there can be any recourse in the law. I don't think the Trump story goes away. I think we don't cover, none of us covers the Trump story, but I don't think that any of the NPR or the New York Times or the Washington Post is just like, we're done with that story. That story will continue to be a thing. Well, that's a whole, I think that was, this is a personal opinion. I think it was a political moment. I think Democrats were looking for the high ground on Roy Moore. They didn't want to be attacked because of Al Franken. And I was just reading today about the many people who are, saying they'll never vote for Kristen Gillibrand. And that is a very, there's a lot of energy and upset about what happened there. None of us covered that, and I don't even think it was. I think it was a news story that then became a political football.
So you don't know any other things that happened other than what we read?
No, the Franken story really is about allegations that we know in the public realm, and that Democrats were fearful that even if it's just more of the same, if there turned out to be 20 women saying he's touched the bottom, Senator of the United States shouldn't be doing that. Now, let's not forget Hillary Clinton, in one of her books, I think, wrote about Strom Thurmond, I think, essentially groping her in the elevator as they'd go up in the Senate's corridor. On the other hand, she figured this guy's in his late 80s or 90s at the time, and she didn't find it charming at all, but she also wasn't going to do about it. The fact that Franken's actions might not in an earlier age have led to pressure, particularly from his own party, to step down may either reflect what some of his admirers think were trumped up charges or exaggerated charges, or may reflect the fact that the United States Senate has very little accountability on itself, that essentially they figure that, it takes a 6-year term, and at the end of your 6-year term, your voters hold you accountable. And since he had just won re-election, I think he thought he could ride it out, and yet his own caucus edged away from him. And I think that you cannot look at that in the absence of thinking about the Alabama race and thinking they're going to cloud the ability to prevent somebody who's been credibly and multiply accused of physical interactions and harassment of underage teenagers, and when he was a district attorney. Democrats just didn't want to be in that position. But I do think that 25 years earlier, they might have stood by their colleague in a different way, and maybe that's to the wrong, and maybe that's to the good.
Let's take another question.
Hi, I just want to start off by thanking you all for your reporting. It's been really excellent. My name is Ari. I'm a student here at the School of Media and Journalism. My question is, how should cases on college campuses be reported differently Obviously, we're here at UNC, then cases with celebrities or executives. You talked a lot about due process, and the rules in sort of Title IX hearings are sort of different from the legal process. So yeah,
are you talking about involving students?
Involving students or athletes who are accused of these types of things with sexual misconduct.
Emily, you're the Daily Tar Heel. You want to take that on?
It's a really great question. I think that you should be aggressive, and I think that you should pursue these stories, and I think that you should pursue them fairly and accurately, and this is a public university, so file your Freedom of Information requests and get information and talk to people and talk to sources and get police reports and talk to as many people as possible. Be aggressive, get the stories, but be fair and be accurate. And I mean, look at the university community, look at professors. I'm sure there's a lot of stories to do, and I think that as a student journalist, one of the most powerful things that you can do is take these big issues that are happening in society and localize them and say, what does this mean for this university and this campus?
Hey, Emily, can I ask one question?
Sure.
So, at the risk of sounding like an olds, when I was a student campus editor at Cornell, we existed on paper. So we were aggressive, we tried, we aspired. Perhaps we didn't measure up to the Daily Tar Heel, but we aspired to do exactly what you say. It strikes me now that, things are really important to write about, accountability, student leaders, all the rest, but it's gonna live forever. Something somebody does and is accused of when they're 19 is going to live forever in a way that, although somebody could go back up to Ithaca and clip something out and photocopy it and, reproduce it in a newspaper and might, is just instantaneous. K-file at CNN is going to find you wherever you are, right? So does that change in any way the equation of what you think a student editor should write about, knowing that that record will endure instantaneously?
I think that's something that you definitely should consider, but I do think that people shouldn't hold back their reporting, and I think as long as the reporting's fair and as long as the reporting's accurate, that it's something that you should pursue.
Barbara, you work with college students all the time.
Yeah, I'll add something to that. Having read thousands and thousands of college newspaper stories about sexual assault, I would say there are more names of victims published in college newspapers than anyone accused. And sometimes that's because the records aren't available. But one of the things that college media do very well is to provide a platform for people who have been victims of not just sexual assault, but the whole spectrum of sexual misconduct. I think that's a real advantage. On a college campus, reporters are in proximity to victims as well as people who are perpetrating the misconduct. And they're able to, particularly at the DTH, and I don't say that with bias, I say that from reading thousands of articles. The DTH did an outstanding job and sustained their coverage for many, many years by building up a very, very deep bench of sources and creating joining a network of survivors that were coming together around 2013, 2014, becoming part of that network. So that really strengthened their reporting. But your question about where do these records exist in perpetuity and are they going to harm someone, I think is a worthwhile question. But from what I've read in print and online, I have seen far more victims' names than anyone accused.
I think also, like, when we do these stories at the Times, our legal department is very closely involved, and so call, what is it, the Student Press Law Center, and get advice, talk to advisors, make sure that that you're not crossing any lines, but I don't think you should hold back any of this reporting.
I think we have time for one more. Somebody have the microphone?
Thank you. So yeah, I'd like to start by saying thank you so much for all the work that you guys do and trying to bring some awareness and exposure to what's happening. So we're here because of national level stories. As some of you mentioned, these are cases that are worthy of national TV. I was wondering, where do we go from here? It's like, what is the role of journalism and investigative journalism in trying to understand the underlying problem that's going on? This is a national disease, in my opinion, and it should be treated and covered as a national disease. We should understand the statistics around it. How many claims do we have? How many cases are settled? Things like this. We should understand the EEOC. How do they operate the process? The legal review. All of those elements that makes it difficult for women and men themselves to stand up against sexual harassment. We're here because of some strong women who are willing to do that. But how do we make it easier, or at least raise awareness about the process that makes it difficult to understand this national disease? Thank you.
Somebody want to take that one up?
I mean, what we do is report, and we are moving into different, just as the New York Times went to Ford, we just had a piece about Teamsters who are drivers on movie sets, and you can imagine how women fare in that environment. So I think, we want to expand the scope, but this is somewhat a policy thing. For example, in Hollywood, there are two entities. There's a commission headed by Anita Hill now, trying to create systems in Hollywood so people do have somebody to complain to so that there can be recourse. And then there's also this group called the Time's Up movement, which has collected a lot of money. Actually, in the scheme of things, it's about $20 million, I think, which is not going to go that far. But the idea somehow, and they're still figuring this out, is how to help women in other industries who are not actresses and movie stars. And I can tell you they're in growing pains. It's early days, but this was not something that we do. This is something that institutions have to do. When we can expose a problem, and then the institutions have to figure out how they're going to respond.
The Times is one of the specialties of the New York Times is the big Step Back magazine piece. It would seem like this would be an appropriate subject to.
Well, I think it is a great next step and next stage in our reporting is to look not just at these cases, but look at the institutions. And I think you've seen us start to do that, and we're not going to stop reporting about this issue until.
I think if you look at a lot of, maybe it should be made more explicit, but if you look at a lot of the Times coverage and a lot of other news organizations, you see the problems being identified that need resolution, the question of arbitration being binding and secret, the question of non-disclosure agreements being forced upon complainants, mostly women, the norms that have been taken for granted that effectively, whether intentionally or not, serve to protect the institution's reputation at the cost of its own workers. Think about all the women who Riley targeted over the years who are on the Fox payroll. Same for Roger Ailes. These are their own employees they're allowing being harmed. In a certain light, the casting light of this, it's not implicit, it's explicit about what needs to be changed. The editorial pages get to decide what they want to recommend, how that be done. And we often look at stories and say, well, what's worked right? You've seen a spate of stories about mass shooting, I think, in the north of England or Scotland, and how norms and laws changed in England, again in '96 in Australia, how laws and norms changed in Australia. We can do stories about what has worked right without having to ram it down people's throat and say, this is the only way something can be done. And to your point, sadly, I think this is less a national and more a human issue. I think this transcends borders. I think there are ways in which America is more conscious than some other cultures that we consider peers. And it's a problem in this global world, but I think that the last year and a half has been revelatory for all of us about the things that were in plain sight all along.
And we'll have that as our last word. I want to thank the panel for coming to Chapel Hill and being with us this evening.
I think just two things to end on, besides which, what a fabulous panel. But anybody was wondering about the state of journalism today? Yeah, relevance, power, importance, and the best, okay? I think you hear it. I mean, it's alive and well. Thank you for that. And the second thing I would say is, we were talking before we came over, I don't think I ever would have thought this story would happen. I started, you know, I was the first woman in every place, you know. I never thought it would happen, even when Gretchen and Carlson also went. So I ask one thing of you young people, okay? I'm going to quote Emily, because you're my alum. I hope the men will respect your colleagues, and the women will respect their colleagues. It's men and women's jobs, but it's in your hands now. You can't say you didn't know, and I expect more out of the workplace than we found in ours. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you all for coming.
Thanks. Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you.